April 17, 1945. 10:47 a.m. Southampton Docks, Hampshire. Clouds parted over grey water. Margaret Schultz stepped down the gangway onto British soil. Her vermicked auxiliary uniform stiff with salt spray. And 3 weeks of fear. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the certainty that she might die. Around her, 67 other women shuffled forward in silence. No one spoke. Speaking drew attention. Attention meant selection. Selection meant a bullet. But the British sergeant stationed at the foot of the ramp simply checked a clipboard, nodded to a translator, and said something that made no sense. Medical inspection first, then tea. Margaret glanced at the woman beside her. Neither understood. Tea, the sergeant gestured toward a canvas tent where 2 nurses waited, their red cross armbands vivid against khaki. No rifles. No dogs, no shouting. One of the nurses smiled. That smile would undo everything Margaret thought she knew about strength. If this story surprises you, you're not alone. Hit subscribe because the history they didn't teach you is the history that matters most. For 2 years, Margaret and her colleagues had absorbed a consistent narrative. Capture by the Allies meant humiliation, starvation, forced labor until death. The propaganda films were explicit. British and American soldiers were portrayed as barbaric, driven by revenge, incapable of restraint. Women, prisoners, they were told, would fare even worse. The stories circulated in whispers among the Signals Corps women stationed in occupied France. Girls who fell into enemy hands simply vanished. No letters, no trace. So when the collapse came in April 1945, and the remnants of their unit were overrun by British forces near Calais, Margaret expected cruelty. She steeled herself for it. What she encountered instead would prove far more disorienting than violence. It would force her to question not just the war, but the entire framework of belief that had sustained her through it. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and boiled wool. A British doctor, probably 50, examined Margaret's hands, calloused from signal equipment, and asked in halting German if she had any injuries. She shook her head. He checked her eyes, her throat, made notes, then nodded toward a chair where a nurse offered her a tin mug. Hot tea, real tea, with half a spoon of sugar dissolved in it. Margaret held the mug, but didn't drink. It had to be a trick. Poison, perhaps. Or a test to see who was weak enough to accept enemy kindness. The nurse noticed her hesitation and took a sip from her own cup. It's just tea, love. You're safe now. Safe. The word landed like a foreign object. Margaret drank. The warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in months, her hands stopped shaking. She looked down at the mug. Standard issue British tin, dented on one side, the kind a soldier might carry through a campaign. It would become, in her memory, the symbol of everything that followed. Britain's treatment of prisoners of war was not accidental. It was policy built on 4 pillars that senior command enforced with bureaucratic rigor. First, Security. Prisoners behind wire posed no threat. Cruelty created resistance. Decency created compliance. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners talked. Brutalized. Prisoners fabricated lies or remained silent. Third, diplomacy and reciprocity. The British government knew that German forces held tens of thousands of Allied POWs. Treatment given was treatment expected. In return, every Red Cross inspection of a British camp was leverage for inspecting camps in Germany. Fourth, morality. Britain had signed the Geneva Convention and intended to be seen honoring it even when the enemy did not. By 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners on home soil. Mortality rates in British P camps remained under 0.3%, a figure sustained by adequate rations, medical care, and enforcement of international standards. Red Cross inspectors visited regularly and filed detailed reports. Caloric intake for working prisoners averaged 2,800 and 3,000 per day. Discipline was maintained, but violence against prisoners by guards was a court-martial offense. This wasn't sentiment. It was civilization under pressure. Applying restraint when vengeance would have been easier. And for women, PS relatively rare, numbering only a few thousand by war's end. The policy held with added caution. Female prisoners were housed separately, overseen by female officers, where possible, and accorded the same medical and dietary standards as male. P.S. The system worked not because it was generous, but because it was consistent. At the processing center outside Southampton, Margaret and the others were issued new blankets, given prisoner identity tags, and photographed. A British officer explained the camp rules in slow, clear German. No escape attempts, no destruction of property, compliance with work assignments. Medical staff would visit weekly. Male privileges would begin after initial screening. The women were loaded onto trucks and driven north to a repurposed country estate in Shropshire that now served as a P facility for female auxiliary personnel. High fences, yes. Guards, yes. But the barracks were weatherproof, heated with coal stoves, and equipped with proper latrines. That first evening they were served dinner: boiled potatoes, tinned beef, bread, margarine, and tea. It wasn't luxury, but it was more than Margaret had eaten in a single meal in weeks. She ate slowly, methodically, unwilling to let her body believe this was sustainable. Around her, two younger women wept silently into their plates. Another sat motionless, staring at the bread as though it might vanish. No one spoke. The quiet was not peace. It was disbelief. Suspended. Within a week, the women were assigned to agricultural labor details. Britain's farms were critically short-handed. The war had drained rural communities of young men and the land. Girls could not meet demand alone. German PS, male and female, became essential to the 1945 harvest. Margaret's group was sent to a dairy cooperative in Shropshire, 12 women, tasked with milking, mucking stalls, and processing milk into butter and cheese. under the supervision of a skeptical farmer named Mr. Hargreaves. He was 63, lean, and spoke rarely. On the first morning, he showed them the milking parlor, demonstrated the equipment once, and said, "You'll work 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'll be paid in camp script. You'll be treated fairly if you work fairly." Then he left them to it. Margaret had never milked a cow before. Neither had most of the others. But they learned quickly, driven by the unspoken understanding that failure meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was more frightening than hard work. By the end of the first week, Mr. Hargreaves grunted his approval. "You'll do." It was the first compliment Margaret had received from an enemy. The work was honest. The supervision was firm, but not cruel. And at the end of each day, they returned to camp with enough energy left to write letters, mend clothes, or simply sit by the stove with mugs of tea. The mug, again, always the mug. It became Margaret's anchor. Proof that this strange new reality was not a dream. Mr. Hargreaves's wife was the first to break the ice. 3 weeks into the work detail, she appeared at the dairy with a basket of scones still warm from the oven. She set them on the workbench, nodded to the women and said simply, "Tea time." Margaret hesitated. The other women hesitated. Mrs. Hargreaves poured tea from a thermos, added milk, and handed the first cup to Margaret. "Go on then. It won't bite." They ate in silence. P.S. On one side of the workbench, Mrs. Hargreaves on the other. But the silence was different now, less wary, more human. Over the following months, small gestures accumulated. A borrowed coat when the rain turned cold. An invitation to Sunday dinner in the farmhouse kitchen where the Hargreaves' daughter served roast chicken and asked polite questions about Germany. A birthday cake, plain but real, for one of the younger women. None of it was required. None of it was policy. It was something harder to name. The quiet decision, repeated daily, to see enemies as people. By autumn, Margaret was trusted to drive the tractor unsupervised, a task that required both skill and discretion. She could have sabotaged equipment. She could have fled. She did neither. In July, one of the women, a signals technician named Hilda, developed a severe infection in her hand from a cut sustained during farm work. The camp medical officer, a Scottish doctor named Captain Fraser, examined her and immediately ordered hospitalization. She was transferred to the local civilian hospital in Shrewsbury, where she shared a ward with British patients recovering from surgeries and illnesses. The nurses treated her wound with the same care they gave everyone else: clean dressings, sulfur drugs, attentive monitoring. Hilda recovered fully within 10 days. When she returned to camp, she was subdued. One evening, she told Margaret, "The nurse asked me if I had family. I said, yes, a brother. She asked if I'd heard from him. I said, no. She said, I hope he's safe. And she meant it." Hilda paused, staring into her tea. "I don't understand them, Margaret. understood the confusion. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, which could be endured with hatred intact. It had not prepared them for decency, which demanded a reckoning. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow and a peculiar tension. The war in Europe had ended in May. The women were no longer enemies in any tactical sense, but they were not yet free. Repatriation was delayed by logistics, paperwork, and the sheer scale of displaced persons across Europe. On Christmas Eve, the camp chaplain, a mild Anglican minister, organized a carol service in the camp's makeshift chapel. Attendance was optional. Margaret went, mostly out of boredom. The chaplain opened with Silent Night, and the British guards standing at the back of the room joined in. Then, to Margaret's shock, he switched to German. Still, Hilligan. The women sang tentatively at first, then with gathering strength. When the service ended, the chaplain distributed small parcels, a chocolate bar, a pair of wool socks, a packet of biscuits from the parish, he said. They wanted you to have something. Margaret held the chocolate and thought of Christmases before the war. Horror. Mother's kitchen, her brother's laughter, the smell of Labuchan baking. She cried quietly and no one stopped. Horror. In early 1946, censored mail privileges expanded. Margaret was allowed to write home twice a month. Horror. Letters were reviewed by British intelligence, but rarely redacted unless they contained details about camp locations or military infrastructure. She wrote carefully, aware that anything she said could be used as propaganda by either side. But she also wrote truthfully. I am treated fairly here. We work on a farm. The food is adequate. I am not beaten. I am not starved. The British are strict but not cruel. I do not know when I will come home, but I am alive and I am whole. Her mother's reply, when it finally arrived in March, was shaken. We were told you were dead. We were told prisoners were executed. I wept for you for months. Thank God. Thank God. Margaret realized holding that letter that the propaganda had poisoned both sides. Her mother had believed the worst. Margaret had believed the worst. Both had been wrong. And that wrongness was the crack through which doubt could enter. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. By spring 1946, the camp had established a small library stocked with German language books donated by 8 organizations and a handful of English novels for those learning the language. Margaret borrowed a copy of Pride and Prejudice and labored through it with a dictionary. Fascinated by the ordinariness of the world. It described a world where the greatest crisis was a misunderstood proposal. A music club formed. Several women had been trained musicians before the war, and the camp commandant allowed them to practice in the recreation hall twice a week. They sang German lieder, British folk songs, even a few American standards taught to them by a visiting U.S. liaison officer. The Americans were a revelation in themselves. They arrived in June 1946 as part of an inter-allied coordination effort inspecting P camps to ensure consistent standards. Margaret's first sight of a U.S. officer, a young captain from Ohio, chewing gum and speaking in an accent she found nearly incomprehensible, was jarring. He was friendly, aggressively friendly. He asked the women if they had complaints, if they were being treated well, if they needed anything. He took notes. He smiled constantly. He called them ladies. After he left, one of the older women muttered, "Are all Americans like that?" "I think so," Margaret said. Exhausting, but also strangely reassuring. The Americans had no personal stake in the European war's bitterness. They treated the prisoners with the same brisk procedural courtesy they seemed to apply to everything. Another signal that the war's hatreds were not universal, not inevitable. Civilization, Margaret was learning, was a choice that could be made even in the midst of ruin. Not every guard was patient. Not every interaction was smooth. In August, a young British corporal, new to the camp, barely 20, lost his temper when one of the women spoke back during a work assignment. He raised his voice, stepped too close, and for a moment it seemed violence might follow. It didn't. The camp sergeant intervened immediately, pulled the corporal aside, and dressed him down in clipped, furious English. Margaret couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unmistakable. "You don't do that here." The corporal was reassigned the next day. The message was clear. The barbed wire was the punishment. The isolation was the punishment. Cruelty was not policy, and those who practiced it would not remain. It was a small incident, but it mattered because it demonstrated that restraint was not weakness. It was discipline, the kind that held, even when no one was watching. By late 1946, restrictions had loosened considerably. Margaret and several others were allowed supervised walks beyond the camp perimeter on Sunday afternoons. Eventually, the supervision was dropped. They walked the Shropshire lanes in pairs, breathing air that smelled of hay and woodsome smoke, and no one stopped them. They could have run. The hedgerows offered cover. The villages offered anonymity. But where would they go? Germany was rubble. Repatriation was coming. And, truthfully, life in the camp had settled into something bearable, almost routine. Some of the women began volunteering for extra shifts during harvest season, driven by a strange pride in their competence. They weren't fighting for Britain, but they were proving something to themselves, that they could work with dignity, that their labor had value, that they were more than what the war had tried to make them. Mr. Hargreaves noticed one evening, as they loaded the last milk cans onto the truck, he said, "You've done good work here. Better than I expected." It was the closest thing to affection he'd ever offered. Margaret nodded. "Thank you," and meant it. Late at night, lying in her bunk with the mug of evening tea cooling on the floor beside her, Margaret turned the question over and over If the propaganda about Allied cruelty was false, and it was demonstrably false, what else had been a lie? The necessity of the war, the righteousness of the cause, the demonization of the enemy. She didn't have answers, but the questions themselves were dangerous, destabilizing, freeing. Years later, in a letter to Mrs. Hargreaves, one of dozens exchanged over 3 decades, Margaret would write, "I learned more about strength in that camp than I ever did in uniform. Real strength is not domination. It is restraint. It is the choice to be decent when cruelty would be easier. You and your husband taught me that, though you never said it aloud. The lesson was quiet, but it was permanent." Repatriation began in earnest in early 1947. Most of the women returned to Germany, uncertain of what lay ahead. The country was divided, devastated, occupied. Families were scattered. Homes were ruins. A few opted to stay in Britain temporarily, taking contracts as agricultural workers while they saved money or awaited clearer information about conditions back home. Margaret remained until the autumn of 1947. She worked the harvest one last time, attended a final Sunday dinner with the Hargreaves family, and accepted a small parcel for the journey, tea, biscuits, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, with a note tucked inside. Remember that decency is always a choice. Safe travels. Write if you can. She did write. For 30 years. The letters traveled back and forth. Awkward at first, then warm, then familial. Margaret rebuilt her life in Hamburg. Married a teacher, raised 2 children. She rarely spoke about the war, but she kept the tin mug. She kept it on her kitchen shelf, dented and faded. And sometimes when her children asked about it, she would say only, "It's from England. It reminds me that people are complicated." The war had taught millions that strength was violence, that victory required revenge, that the enemy was less than human. But in a camp in Shropshire, in a dairy cooperative, in a farmhouse kitchen, a different lesson was taught. Not through speeches, but through small, repeated acts of restraint. Tea offered, wounds tended, work respected, dignity preserved. It wasn't kindness. It was something harder. Civilization choosing itself, even when brutality would have been easier. Margaret learned that strength is not what you do to your enemies when you have power over them. Strength is what you refuse to do. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and why. The tin mug sat on Margaret's shelf for 40 years, dented and unremarkable. But every time she made tea, she remembered. The measure of a nation is not its weapons, but its self-restraint.